Some projects, without a doubt, are just incredibly expensive, and you may feel like there's no way around it, especially with today's prices. But there are ways that you can cut the cost of a project in half while maintaining top-notch quality. And there's nothing better than a beautifully finished product without breaking the bank. So join me as I build a $12,000 accent wall for half the cost, and I'll share all of the hidden tricks along the way so that you can save thousands on your end, too.
This is 250 board feet of oak. And it's about as much as my truck can take.
Actually, it's technically 600 pounds over what my truck is rated for. And I will be moving these heavy 12-foot boards many, many times through this entire process of the build. But it wasn't actually my choice to buy such absurdly long stock. It's just that the ceilings in this home are over 9 feet tall, and the next size up from 8-footers that I could source were 12-footers. But I'm actually thinking that the cutoffs will come in handy for other aspects of the build, and this wood is pretty economical, so I'm not too worried. But if it's white oak, then how is it economical? Well, it all starts with how well the finished product sells the look. Details like pre-planned gapping around the door trim will add visual value. Then, ending each array with full slats will need to be precision work, but the final result will speak for itself. Lastly, the floating media cabinet will be solid wood, with cutaway handles in the doors and a wall-mounted TV that will finish off the look nicely. And all of those details matter because this is red oak, which is literally a quarter of the price, but that's because it's less desirable, which certainly saves on cost, but there will be a lot of different tricks that I use to make sure this looks like an expensive product in the end. So before you click off because you're a red oak hater, just give it a chance because there will definitely be a few great tricks that you can keep in your back pocket. So I think I have enough boards for the long slats, but I'm also going to need a section above the door where the slats are much shorter. And I was expecting to be able to use those cutoffs that I already had, but of course they were 1 inch too short, as always. And this is exactly why I keep a shim close by, because there's always that one board that just gets truly jammed on the riving knife. For me, I'm cutting the strips a 1/4 inch wider than what their final width will be so that I can mill them straight again. But for you, you might not have a way to re-straighten them after you cut them, so you might as well just cut them to final width now. And some of these boards get pretty wonky along the way, so I have to rejoint them so that I can continue cutting strips. While I joint them, I'll tell you about the first step that I took to making sure this project looks like white oak in the end. And it really all comes down to selection. I took extra time in selecting each board so that I would have a tighter grain pattern and a color closer to white oak. And some of them are so accurate, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference in a lineup.
Oh, that is 102 slats. And I've touched each one of these one too many times today. So instead of sanding these today, I'm gonna move on to the MDF panels.
These are actually 10-foot sheets of 1/4 inch MDF, and I really wish I didn't have to use any sheet goods in this project, but I really need a backer board for the slats. So cutting them to just over 9 feet and manhandling them onto the saw will probably be the silliest part of my day. The point of even having a backer board is then I can install the slats to it using pin nails from the backside rather than just installing the slats directly to the wall and having a million different holes to fill. Additionally, the MDF will provide a flat surface to mount the slats to rather than some wavy wall that isn't consistent. I'm spraying one single coat of cheap paint. That way the gaps appear black and that's really all I need it for. So saving cost on unimportant details like this can really add up over time. And if you really want to get fun with it, you could choose a cool accent color.
All right, it's the next day and these are dry. I'm not actually going to utilize these for another few days, so for now I'm going to set them aside and start gluing up panels for the floating cabinet.
When I was originally going through the boards to slice them into strips, I reserved 3 or 4 really nice boards so that I could use them for the floating cabinet. These have really tight and very balanced grain. That way when they're glued up into panels, they look really, really good. But these honkers are going to be monsters to push through this jointer, so I better wax it first. And I'm basically just taking a featherly light cut because my sissy little arms will cry if I take too deep of a pass. So if this was a white oak accent wall, it would have costed around $12,000. I know that sounds really expensive, but with everything entailed, that's just what it would have costed. And with the budgeting decisions that I've made for this build, it's costing around $6,500, so basically half the cost. And one of those budgeting decisions, ironically enough, was to actually make this cabinet out of solid wood rather than plywood. And I know this is usually against common logic, but in this case, a few sheets of plywood would have costed around $300, while the boards themselves costed like $50 tops. And now I get to control what grain orientation there is and what color the boards are so that it actually looks like white oak in the end, because that's the more important aspect. Even though there's always something that comes up when you're using solid wood.
So what's weird is after I finished cutting this, I noticed that there was a crack in this board and it just showed up as soon as I cut them apart. So the best thing I can do right now is just glue it back together.
And here's a really good one that you probably haven't heard. If you seal the wood with water first before you glue the crack back together, then any glue squeeze out that comes out won't stain the face grain of the wood. And if you've ever had to sand out glue staining on wood, especially a porous wood like red oak, then you know it takes a ton of time. So in essence, if this saves you a ton of time, then it will save you a ton of money. I cut the front bevel on each of the panels with the table saw first, and now I'm refining it with a router. My router bit will leave a much smoother and more consistent surface than any table saw blade I have. But it left this little edge, so I'll just have to take care of that with a hard sanding block. So far we have the 4 main panels made and the bevels cut on the front sides. But before we cut the miters to connect everything together, I want to cut the center dado in each panel to accommodate the center panel. And since my panels are a little bit longer than they need to be, all I need to do is hit close to the center. And I think a single blade on a table saw will do just fine in this case because it's only a 1/2 inch wide dado. Now referencing from that dado, I can cut the miters on either side. That'll just make sure that the dado is actually indeed centered in the panel. And the blue tape will just keep it from tearing out on the front important side. Most importantly though, I want to make sure everything lines up and that both panels are the same exact length, otherwise the miters won't go together very well. The top joints are going to have a waterfall aligned look, so I'm making sure I don't cut too much off, otherwise the grain could misalign. So any excess gets cut off on the bottom or non-show side.
Okay, it's the next day. Now that I have these sides cut, I know the exact internal height of the cabinet, which means I can make the center panel.
But I'm not just cutting it to that exact height because there needs to be extra for each dado, the top and bottom. And a common practice that you'll see a lot is that people will do a stopped dado so that you don't see that groove on the front side. But we don't even need to worry about that here because I have a different plan. First, let's sneak up on the fit so that it's nice and snug.
So I think since I cut my dado on the table saw with a single blade, the dado is not a perfect width all the way through. So you can see the back of my panel actually slides in now, while the front is still a little tight, which is fine. I'll just finesse that tenon.
And now that that side's good, I can just cut the other side, and in this case, I didn't even have to finesse it, so I got lucky. And the shoulders of the tenons line up perfectly with the miters. There needs to be a cutaway on the top back side of this panel to accommodate the French cleat system that I'll be using to hang the cabinet. And any miters can also be finessed with that same sanding block. I think waterfall grain looks the best when the joints look the best. This is the part of the build where it's easy to forget to do something important before you glue everything together, like sanding the inside, or drilling out any holes that wires need to pass through, or even drilling the shelf pin holes. I swear I always forget to do this. And it's just a nuisance to have to do any of this stuff after the cabinet is glued up. And if you're having a really unlucky day, there might be something you can't do because it's too late. At this point, I'm a little skeptical because this blue tape is supposed to block any glue squeeze out, but I'm worried that this red oak is too coarse and the glue will actually go underneath the blue tape. So for now, I'll admit I'm riding on a little bit of hope. And the clamping cauls are also clamped on so that I don't have to glue them on. Luckily, the first joint went together without a hitch, and it's time for the second. And I'm quickly noticing that I'm having trouble aligning these things, and maybe you know why, but I just don't know why it's so challenging this time. But either way, I got the first two done, and I'm doing something a little bit different for the middle. I'm using epoxy in the dado because due to the nature of this joint, it's actually end grain to side grain gluing up. And that's not usually very strong with wood glue. I'm not saying that wood glue would fail, I'm just saying that I feel a little bit better using epoxy. And to my surprise, as much as I thought it wouldn't work, that blue tape actually worked perfectly.
Well, it's always something. I was standing here just pondering how amazing the glue up went. And then I noticed, wow, I literally jammed a clamp into the front of this cabinet and made a pretty bad dent. So I had a chance to sleep on it, and I'm still gonna graft on a piece of wood. I'm just gonna do it the harder way because it'll look better. And this is a great opportunity to do more work for less money.
So how am I going to dig myself out of this one? After all, this is a video about saving money, and I'm about to do more work for less money. And the truth is, yeah, this mistake will cost a little bit of wages, but that's really just short term. If you're making something for yourself, you want to be able to look at it in the future and be proud of the patience that you took. And if you're making it for a client, I really think the same thing applies. So by cutting the entire front strip off, I can match that wood exactly and glue a new board on. And leaving it extra thick will let me clamp it extremely hard so that joint completely disappears. While that glue cures, it's a perfect time to work on this center stile, which needs to have the bevels cut and they will need to line up with the face of the cabinet. You can see with this test piece that without a dado it sits way too proud, so cutting a groove will allow it to sit properly. Except I cut it too deep and way too wide. And no one likes a sloppy fit, so I'm going to change that on the final piece. And I can tell that my brain isn't firing on all cylinders because I cut this miter thinking that it's going to mate up perfectly, but it doesn't, because then there's a missing section. So no problem, I can just cut a coping joint, then it'll fit perfectly. The other side can be cut just the same way. And it was worth the work because that fits like a glove. And this is exactly why I didn't need a stopped dado, because I'm covering it with a style in the end anyways. And it's fun to think of solutions like this because cutting this piece was a lot more fun than cutting any stopped dado. The repair on the side is now dry and I can cut it flush. The bulk of the material served its purpose for clamping, and now I can do away with the rest. Flushing up the outside edge is easy enough with hand plane. It's the inside beveled edge that I'm going to have to think of something creative for. So my best solution here is just to clamp a board for support and then use the router to flush things up, which is working great. I'm just keeping it a touch proud. Since this obviously leaves a section in the corners where it's not flush, I'll have to hand chisel those clean, then refine it with a sanding block. And not only is the repair disappearing on that edge, but it's also about to disappear on the outside edge.
I am extremely happy with how this repair turned out. It's literally invisible and worth all of the extra time that it took. This centerpiece is fitting like a glove and it's amazing. So we can move on to finishing the back of the cabinet as well as the doors.
I mentioned earlier that I'm using a French cleat system, and the center panel needed that cutaway so that this strip can go all the way across without obstruction. I'm also adding a few screws here and there because this will inevitably be under a lot of force. You can actually see where I misdrilled, and if I put a screw in that bottom hole, it would have actually caused problems. The doors are next on the list, and I actually glued up the panels earlier on. I did it this way so that I could cut the panels in half and have two doors that have grain continuity where they meet. This helps sell the fact that it's a high-end piece and adds that visual value factor. I'm using a zero clearance throat plate so that I don't get tear out, and if I do get any, it'll be on the back sides of the doors where you can't really see it and I could probably sand it away anyways.
I spent the rest of yesterday off camera testing different jigs to see if I could get cutaway handles that I liked, and I just don't like these samples very much. So today I made a new jig, and this cutaway is really, really nice. I like this a lot. You can buy bits that do this. This project just doesn't have that budget, so I'm gonna do it this way.
I wanted to tell you that cutaway handles would be cheaper than having to buy hardware, but after spending a quarter of a day designing it so that I don't get tear out, it probably was a lot more expensive than just buying some poles off Amazon. And on top of it, I have to take segmented cuts so that I actually get a nice cut in the end. So I think it's agreed that this is probably not where we're saving our money in the project. Instead, I think it's adding to the custom look, because anybody can just buy any hardware and slap it on, but it takes a woodworker to actually have to cut a handle like this and make it look really good too. And part of what makes them look so good is the clean cuts with no burning. So for that, I really do suggest Bits and Bits, because you'll see right now that this bit cuts so cleanly it's satisfying. I'll put links in the description for several bits that I suggest for this project. Since I'm using this 1/4 inch bit, I'm gonna have to take a few different passes so that it has a better grip for someone's fingers. Sometimes it's not about having the exact right tool for the job. Part of the fun in woodworking is finding ways to accomplish a task with the things that you already do have. But you can take my word for it. If you do try this with dull bits, you will be sanding for days trying to get that burning out. So for this one, it's definitely worth the cost of having sharp bits. But somehow I still managed to screw it up on this one cut because I was going a little bit too fast. And the super glue trick with a tiny piece of wood is a fail. So I guess I'll have to do super glue and sanding dust on this one. There really are 1.5 million ways to problem solve in woodworking, and that's one thing that I really like about it. Because you or I have the choice. We get to choose how good our project looks in the end, based on how much effort we put into the design and fabrication of a project, and how much patience we have when we screw up. And doing a bevel on these doors could have caused a huge problem if I wasn't paying attention. The bearing on the router bit could have fallen into the cutaway, but I stopped just short and now I'm just sanding it with the block. When I think about how to cut the cost of a project in half, I don't always think about just using cheap stuff. Even though it's really easy to gravitate that way because saving money on items is inevitably saving cost on the project altogether. But a lot of savings come from experience and knowledge as you begin to do things more and more. Even if you're a hobbyist woodworker, it's easy to make silly mistakes like buying the wrong hinges or thinking that cheap plywood from the big box store will suffice and then it fights you every step of the way. And over time, with things like that accumulating, it can double the cost of a project without you even knowing it. When I was buying materials for this project, I had a choice to make. I could either buy an entire sheet of plywood just to make the internal shelves, or I could plan on making them a different way. And I more or less neglected that question up until this point, and I'm kind of glad I did, because there was plenty of cutoffs to glue them together and just make solid wood shelves. The last step on this floating cabinet is to meticulously sand the outside. If I sanded them towards the beginning, I would have likely just created dents and dings anyways and been inevitably re-sanding everything. There's a few bug holes here and there that need to be filled, and sure, I could just use filler, but any time that I can use actual wood for the repair, it's going to have a lot better color and texture in the end anyways. And wood filler has a higher chance of falling out as the project ages, and why take that chance if you don't need to? Shifting gears back to the slats, there is one slat in particular that needs to be very special. This one will have a finished edge on the left side so that it doesn't expose the MDF, and that's easy enough to make just by gluing an extra strip on, then flush trimming it. Again, I used a thicker strip for clamping reasons, then I'm just cutting it off on the table saw afterwards. You can see how it fits against the MDF. And now, thankfully with a little bit of help, we can sand all 120 strips. The faces, edges, and corners. This took a total of 6 hours. But here's where the magic happens. This is an oil-based gray wash stain. The opacity in the pigment is just enough to cover up the red tone in the oak and lighten the porous parts of the grain. And ironically, when I made the test samples for these clients, I really actually didn't like this color much. But now that I'm staining the final products, I think it could look really good in all sorts of different applications. I'm hanging as many parts as I possibly can, and the rest will just have to sit on sawhorses.
Whew. That was a long day. It's like 9 o'clock here, and thankfully I'm done.
Yeah, done with staining, but after a few days cure time, I still have to clear coat everything, which can be done with a brush a lot better than I thought. And if you're wondering about a lot of my different methods, a perfect place for you to join would be my Patreon. You can talk with me directly in the platform if you have any questions, and there's exclusive content and videos that I'm posting on a weekly basis. So I hope to hear from you, and thanks for supporting the channel. After 2 coats of a water-based urethane, we can scuff sand and do a final coat. This will give the final feel and satin finish. Before we assemble the accent panels, there's a few things to take note of. I need the panel above the door to line up exactly with the trim on either side. The left side array needs to end perfectly at the corner of the wall, and the right side needs to die into the right wall. In order to make all of these happen with precision, the gaps will have to be exact down to the 1,000th of an inch. And they're not all the same either. The right side wall's gaps will be a few thousandths less than the left side wall's gaps. Alright, so I got my strips made, and since my digital calipers aren't that precise when I'm measuring just one, I measure 3 of them at once if 3 of them are supposed to equal 0.87. Then I know each one is 0.29. And measuring multiples at once is definitely a trick you should keep in your back pocket. After blowing the dust off, I'm confident that the silicone will now adhere to the paint. Wood glue would not be a good choice because the oak is pre-finished. On this panel only, the first slat is lined up with the edge of the MDF. Then the correct size spacers can be added, and the strip can be pinned on from the back side. I'm using the table as a reference on where to shoot. So this panel needs to be 35¼ wide total. So for this last one, before I pin it, I'm just making sure it hits that mark, and it does. For the tall panels that fit against the door trim next, I need that 1/4 inch gap first, and referencing the edge of the MDF will help that strip be perfectly straight, because every single strip after it will assume the same curve if there is one. Each one of these is about 80 pounds a piece, so just keep that in mind. And the rest will be made in the same manner except for that left-hand side where it needs that special slat. And some panels have a slat that overlaps like this. That's all of them. At install, Bridget can start removing the old trim while I cut the new casing to replace it. I didn't show making this because it's literally just square stock, but it is a little bit thicker than the finished panels, that way it protrudes a little bit. The most important parts are that the sides are plumb and the top is level, because this would inevitably translate into the panels being kinked if the trim is also kinked. As I'm squaring up the first panel, I'm trying to cut it upside down just to see what happens, and this actually results in a lot of tear out, which is surprising. So I'm recutting my square cut but face side up to see if I get a better cut this way, which is why these initial tests are always worth it because it's much cleaner. There's also a return vent that needs to be carefully cut out. Then the piece can be test fit before I add glue, and in my case I had to recut it off camera because it was a little tight. The construction adhesive is a little bit better of a choice in this case because silicone would make their house smell like vinegar for the rest of the day. And a few pin and brad nails will hold it temporarily until the glue sets. For the first tall panel, I'm checking if the floor is level because if it is, then that first cut is a square cut. And luckily it sure is, so that's easy peasy. You can see on the left side of this panel, there's a place for the next panel to overlap it. And this actually serves a purpose. It makes sure that the next panel ends up being flush with the last panel. I just need to make sure I use the proper spacer, then you can see that it's as perfect gets. Now, the right side is going to be a doozy because it has a total of 7 electrical boxes to cut in. And at this point, I can't afford to screw a single one of these up, especially because you know how much work has gone into each one of these panels. If I screwed one up, it could cost thousands. So rest assured, I'm taking my freaking time on this. Every single measurement is taken 3 times, and before I cut, I check it one more time. And it's working because things are starting to come together. Even the last panel just needs a smidge cut off of one little corner and it ends perfectly just like it was supposed to. These French cleats really do make it so easy to mount a floating cabinet. I know that if the cleat is level, then the cabinet will be level. Then I can just add a screw or two so that the cabinet can't come off. The TV also needs to be mounted, followed by caulking and paint touch-ups. We also filled any holes with wax filler off camera, and lastly, the covers can go on. Hey, if you truly enjoyed this content, click subscribe on the left, and here's another awesome video to watch.